The Civil War soldiers of Branford and North Branford was many years in the making. It is 558 pages, includes biographies of nearly 450 soldiers, and has over 400 photographs and illustrations. Many sources were used to gather information on the soldiers: newspapers, Civil War books, gravestones, vital records, and family genealogies. The primary source was from the pensions the soldiers or their families received during and after the war. I made a number of trips to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and researched over 200 pensions. The pensions contain a history of the soldier's service, biographical data including vital records, physical description, occupation, residence, and family information. A widow had to reapply when the soldier died in order to continue receiving the pension. She provided more information, and often neighbors and other family members wrote letters on her behalf. My aim was to chronicle all of Branford's Civil War soldiers, something that has never been done before. There are, of course, the dates, battles, prisons, and deaths, but my primary goal was to tell the soldiers' story through their own words about their service, families, and how the war affected their lives. Like many New England towns, Branford was in transition during the 1860s with the coming of the railroad in 1852. Men began working in the factories instead of on the farm. There had been a 44% increase in population during the previous decade, and the population of Branford in 1860 was 2,137, and that of North Branford, 1,058. 12% of Branford's residents in 1860 were born in Europe, primarily Ireland. The emigrants came to work at the Malleable Iron Fittings Company and the Branford Lock Works, founded in 1854 and 1862. Both grew significantly during the war and were among the leading industries in New Haven County. No references were found, however, to indicate that either factory produced goods for the war effort. The causes of the War of the Rebellion were complex and had simmered for many years. Slavery was only one of them. The war began with the firing at Fort Sumter and the Union surrender on April 12, 1861. The first battle of Bull Run was on July 21st of that year. It was soon realized the conflict would not be over quickly. Branford responded to Connecticut Governor Buckingham and President Lincoln's call for troops in 1861 and 1862. 64% of Branford's men who served enlisted in the summer and fall of 1862. Though there was a draft, very few men were drafted. The town of Branford provided support for the men and their families in the form of money and articles of clothing. Branford had a grand list of about $1 million in 1862. $27,000 was spent on the war. 2 million soldiers fought for the Union during the Civil War, most of whom enlisted. There were public meetings, sermons, posters, recruiters, and bounties, all to entice the young man to enlist. Their reasons for enlisting were many. Foremost was saving the Union, but they also enlisted for adventure, money, and being with their friends. For Branford men, the issue of slavery was probably not among the causes. The state of Connecticut provided a bounty of $300, and Branford added $1.50 per week in addition to their army pay. Many men did not enlist. They wanted to stay home to run their farms. There could be family or health reasons. Some men were opposed to the war or feared fighting. Less than half of Branford's eligible men served. The 27th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry was organized in the summer of 1862 as a 9-month regiment. Company B was Branford's hometown company and was comprised of 43 men from Branford and North Branford and 30 from Wallingford. Branford's only dentist, Dr. Calvin E. Lee, seen here, was elected captain of Company B. The average age in the company was 29. Because it was a 9-month regiment, the soldiers tended to be a little older. Company B was mustered in with the rest of the 27th at Camp Terry in Fairhaven on October 2nd, 1862, where they received their equipment and were trained in discipline and military skills. Townspeople visited the camp often, and women brought food and made the flags for the regiments. Only 3 weeks later, they left on the steamer Quaker City for New York and boarded the train for Washington, D.C., arriving on October 25th. They marched across the Chain Bridge over the Potomac into Arlington Heights, Virginia, where the Army of the Potomac had taken over Robert E. Lee's house and peach orchard, now the site of Arlington Cemetery. The first night, it was cold and rainy, weather that would occur during much of that winter, and many men became ill. By the end of November 1862, 39,000 Union soldiers camped in Northern Virginia were sick with typhoid fever and other illnesses. At camp, they continued their military training. The last day of November 1862, not quite 2 months after enlisting, they marched 50 miles south in a driving rain that turned to snow and arrived at Falmouth, Virginia on December 9th. On December 11th, Company B camped on the bare ground on the Rappahannock River opposite Fredericksburg, Virginia. Merton Wheaton of North Branford wrote home. He said, "Cannonading was heard day and night that probably has never been heard on this continent." On December 12th, 375 men of the 27th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry, including Branford's Company B, crossed over into Fredericksburg. Wheaton wrote, "We were in the city. It was completely riddled with shot and shell. The houses were all blown to bits. That night we lay right in the street without any fires, and the mud was about a foot deep." Henry Boardman of Branford was a private in Company B, and he wrote home, "We got up at 5 in the morning and ate our breakfast of raw pork and hard bread. The day was chilly and foggy. As we moved through the streets, a murderous fire of grape, canister, shot, and shell was opened up upon us." Under orders, the 27th was marched at double time 1,500 yards up Mary's Heights, where at the crest were Confederate fortifications. The ranks of the 27th were decimated by the enemy. Wheaton wrote and remembered, "I then began to realize the horrors of a battlefield, the groans of the wounded, the thunder of shells all mixed together, and 3 or 4 men blown all to pieces by a shell within a few feet from me. I did not get off that field until 10 o'clock in the evening, for I was looking for Josiah and the rest of our boys." 1/3 of the 27th Connecticut Regiment were killed or wounded, including 4 from Company B. Merwin Wheaton's brother-in-law, Josiah Johnson, died, as did George Wilford of Branford. Samuel Beach of Branford was 35 years old, married with several children when he enlisted as a corporal in Company B. His letters home are preserved by the Beach family, and about the Battle of Fredericksburg he said, "All drawn up in the line of battle, one brigade after another, colors streaming, they marched boldly up like Tennyson's 600 into the jaws of death. They were bullied by their officers and advanced amidst the most terrific storm of bullets, canister shot, and shell. They soon broke and fell back. Our regiment behaved well. So far as I can see, the whole operation was a terrible blunder, and indeed the battle was a disaster for the Union, and General Ambrose Burnside was replaced." On December 15th, under the cover of night, the Army of the Potomac retreated back across the Rappahannock River. The 27th had built the temporary pontoon bridges and were the last ones back over, dismantling them as they went. The 27th spent the winter back at camp at Falmouth, Virginia, just west of Fredericksburg. There was more stormy weather, including a severe snowstorm. Each soldier was assigned to picket duty every 2 weeks for 2 days. During this dreaded duty, they were exposed to the elements with very little shelter. Many men became ill from dysentery, fever, and lung problems. That winter, many soldiers deserted. John Robinson of North Branford was in the 27th, and while at camp in Falmouth, he wrote home, "I am well and hearty. We are in the same old camp yet, and I hope we shall stay here until our time is up. The mud is drying up fast, and it will soon be dry enough to march. I think they will try to cross that river when we move again. I don't wish to cross that river again, for it is a hard place to tackle, you can bet. I hope we shall move back towards Washington. We only have 2.5 months longer to serve. Give my respects to all, and tell them I'm as tough as a nut. Your Uncle, John." John Robinson died in June of disease. 4 months after Fredericksburg, on April 8, 1863, President Lincoln visited the camp at Falmouth and reviewed the troops. Less than 1 month later, the 27th Regiment, along with other Union regiments, were marched 10 miles west and fought on May 3, 1863. After intense fighting in a heavily wooded area, the 27th was surrounded by a Georgia regiment, and 280 men, including 38 from Company B, were taken prisoner. Over a 6-day period in the heat, the prisoners were marched over 60 miles to Richmond, Virginia. Many were placed in Libby Prison, a former tobacco warehouse. The conditions were terrible. Fortunately, they were exchanged and paroled 4 days after their arrival. They were sent to Camp Convalescent in Alexandria, Virginia, where they spent the rest of their 9-month term. Companies D and F of the 27th were on picket duty during the Battle of Chancellorsville and so were not captured. Only 75 members of the 27th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry, mostly from Companies D and F, were left to go on to fight at the Battle of Gettysburg on July 3, 1863. The 27th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry was discharged on July 18, 1863, when their 9-month term expired. They arrived in New Haven on July 22nd to a parade and enthusiastic welcome. Only 2 of the soldiers enlisted in other regiments. The 15th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry was also organized in the summer of 1862, but for a term of 3 years. 60 men from Branford and North Branford enlisted in the regiment. John Edwin Towner of Branford was 22 years of age, unmarried, and enlisted as first sergeant of Company C of the 15th. In this capacity, he was in charge of equipment, food, and often put in charge of daily drills. He looks quite pleased with himself in this photograph. The Branford Historical Society is the repository for 95 letters written by Towner during the war to his sister Emily Towner Holcomb of Branford. They reveal a young man's honest view of a soldier's daily activities, the war, its officers, and his longing for home. The 15th spent much of the first part of their service in defense of Washington, D.C., and were stationed at Camp Chase on Arlington Heights, Virginia. His writing, spelling, and grammar is quite good, and the letters are very legible. In his words, "Dear Sister Emily, General Casey said our regiment was the finest-looking body of men and the best marching of any volunteer regiment he has ever seen. Quite a compliment for us, considering the short time we have been in the field. Now we are called Casey's pets by the other Connecticut regiments. You may think that you have dust up home, but I can assure you that such is not the case. When the troops are on the move, great bodies of dust will rise and fill the air, looking very much like a cloud. I should think it would suffocate the horses. They have to work hard for Uncle Samuel and get no thanks and very little to eat. Well, I am sick in two different ways, sick of the leaders and sick in body. Have had a high fever that loosened all my front teeth. If we had real generals instead of civil engineers running the army, we'd have been in Richmond by now. Soldiering and married life are a great deal alike. Plenty of skirmishing and some severe engagements. Had a chaplain from the 8th Connecticut for services today. He was a good one. Our drunken chaplain was on furlough. Butcher Hooker is going to Richmond. He will start with 200,000 men and have 100,000 left when he gets there. And in this letter, he's referring to General Joseph Hooker and the terrible defeat at Chancellorsville and loss of life. And Edwin writes again, I have got entirely disgusted with this climate, quite pleasant one day, blowing great guns the next, and finally finishing off with an old-fashioned snowstorm. Anyone who would be willing to shed his blood in defense of such a climate ought to be put in a lunatic asylum for the rest of his days. What ain't knee-deep with mud is covered with sand, which rises in clouds when the sun shines and wind blows, nearly putting one's eyes out. I would rather face the enemy's bullet than spend another week with all this drunkenness. One sergeant lays in his tent, dead drunk, and is snoring like a thunderclap. If that young lady who is boarding with you is good-looking, give her my best respects. By the way, you may, whether she is or not. Thank you for your Merry Christmas good wishes. Can't accept your invitation, having formed an engagement with Uncle Sam, and he can't spare my services. Now, I am no prophet, but mind what I say. 1865 will see this war ended. Don't deceive yourself in hoping that it will be before. Goodbye and good night, John E. Towner. In January of 1864, still having never fought in a major battle, the 15th was put in assignment at New Bern, North Carolina. Edwin stated in his letters that it was a beautiful city, much like those in the north, with gorgeous shade trees. On September 9th, 1864, while still stationed at New Bern, Mason Rogers of Branford died of yellow fever. Dr. H.V.C. Holcomb of Branford was surgeon of the entire 15th Regiment and predicted that the fever would become epidemic until the first frost. Neither the Army or the other doctors believed him. In total, 3,000 soldiers and civilians were sick and 1,300 died. Over 70 from the 15th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry died, including 4 from Branford. Edwin Towner wrote home that Dr. Holcomb, seen here, although he is not well himself, Dr. Holcomb has rendered constant and invaluable service in nursing the sick and dying of our regiment and among our citizens. Then John Towner writes about himself. I supposed you could be anxious hearing that we were dying with the yellow fever here, and it is true, though some of the doctors deny it. True it is that some plague is here. Well, I should have tried to write sooner, but I was quite unwell. I have been out of the hospital now 4 days, have gained some strength, but am still quite weak. I left William Lindsley and Amy Palmer in there, both getting better. Lindsley had a narrow escape. He was put in the death room once. I never got as far as that, next door to it. Dr. Holcomb has been very kind. John Edwin Towner's last letter home to his sister Emily, seen here in her later years, was just before the Battle of Kingston, North Carolina. He wrote, in my opinion, the end of the conflict will be the annihilation of one or both armies. Nothing short of this will stop the war. We may yet be drawn into the conflict. It has been our good luck to keep clear of it thus far. though we have endured many hardships and have always been where we were ordered. We could do no more than this. The 15th Connecticut Regiment fought at the Battle of Kingston, North Carolina on March 8, 1865. During the battle, they were surrounded by the 57th North Carolina and taken captive. Edwin Towner was wounded, and his diary, now in the possession of the Branford Historical Society, was used in the published regimental history of the 15th to describe their capture and journey to prison in Richmond, Virginia. They were paroled on March 27th and sent back to camp in New Bern. The 15th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry was discharged in New Haven on July 12, 1865, after serving for 3 years. Only 1 month after the capture of the 15th at Kingston, North Carolina, Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, and President Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater on April 14th. This photograph shows Lincoln's funeral procession. After the war, the soldiers returned home to their families and farms. Some lived long lives, others were never well again. In 1881, Branford's Civil War veterans formed the Grand Army of the Republic Post No. 7, called the GAR for short. They held meetings, marched in parades, attended dedications of Civil War monuments throughout the state, placed flags on their comrades' graves, and held reunions until their numbers dwindled. Some of the reunions for both the 15th and the 27th were held in Branford. The 13th reunion of the 15th Connecticut Regiment was held at Branford on August 25, 1897. After a parade and a meeting at the Gaylord Opera House, 200 veterans had dinner at the town hall. The local newspaper reported that Branford never does things in halves, and the collation which awaited the hungry men was a sight to behold. After the meeting, the guests were given a tour of the Blackstone Library. Only 6 surviving members of the 15th still lived in town: Amy Barker, John Edwin Towner, Samuel Fowler, Albert Plant, Charles Frisbee, and William Beach. The town of Branford, its citizens, and post GAR No. 7 erected the Soldiers or GAR Monument on the Branford Green in 1885 in honor of her brave sons who fought in the War of the Rebellion. There are also 5 monuments at Gettysburg in honor of the 27th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry. A monument to the 5th Connecticut Regiment was erected in the National Cemetery in Kingston, North Carolina, and it reads, and is dedicated to the men who died of yellow fever and who fell in action on March 8, 1865. The book examines the service and biography of nearly 450 soldiers. It includes all the men in Company B of the 27th, all men serving from Branford, North Branford, and Northford, also Branford natives that served from other towns or states, and men who came to Branford after the war and spent the rest of their lives here, many of whom are buried in Center Cemetery. What happened to some of Branford's soldiers during and after the war? George C. Baldwin was 19 when he enlisted with some friends as a private in Company B of the 27th Regiment. He wrote home after the Battle of Fredericksburg to tell his parents he was safe, but I have felt pretty limpsy since the battle. He died of typhoid fever 1 month later. His body was sent home, and he is buried in Center Cemetery. More men died of disease during the Civil War than on the battlefield. James Chauncey Hull was 45 when he enlisted in the 15th Regiment. Often these older soldiers did not fare well in the harsh conditions that they experienced. 7 months after entering the Army, James died of typhoid fever in Washington, D.C. He left a wife and 5 children. She soon received a pension of $8 a month plus $1 for each child under 16. These pensions were not a lot of money, and you wonder how the widows survived. Eliza Hull never remarried and is also buried in Center Cemetery. James' brother Eli Hull survived the war. Corporal Samuel Beach of Company B fought in the Battle of Fredericksburg, but soon afterwards became ill and never returned to his regiment. He returned to Branford and his family on East Main Street. He was a farmer and proprietor of the summer resort known as Pawson Park. Sam Beach died in 1892 and is buried in Center Cemetery. The Beach House on East Main Street is still owned by the family, and they possess 50 letters written by Sam during the war. Dr. Calvin Ely was captain of Company B of the 27th, and he was ill during some of the war, and because of it, he was not at the Battle of Chancellorsville. He returned to his dentistry practice in Branford, but eventually gave it up. His eyesight was damaged from sunstroke during the march to Gettysburg. He was one of the founders and first commander of the GAR Post No. 7 and was also a cornet player and founder of the Branford Brass Band. Dr. Ely died in 1905 and is buried in Center Cemetery. Dr. Herbert V.C. Holcomb, mentioned previously, was surgeon of the entire 15th Regiment and the highest-ranking Branford soldier, equivalent to a major. Holcomb's wife, Anise Squire of Branford, died of typhoid fever while visiting him at camp in 1864. Dr. Holcomb returned to Branford after the war, remarried, but was never well again. At the next reunion of the 15th Regiment, a resolution was passed. Resolved that we will ever hold in grateful remembrance the faithful and fearless service of our surgeon rendered us in times of trial, and the warm heart which made his friendship as endearing as his services were indispensable. Albert Plant was a private in the 15th Regiment. He returned to Branford and was a charter member of the GAR Post No. 7. With other members of the Plant family, he owned a large farm on the Branford Hills, and the business was one of the largest producers of strawberries on the East Coast. Albert Plant died in 1914 and is buried in Center Cemetery. Edward Sheldon was a private in Company B, but was in the hospital ill most of the war. He returned to Branford, was married 3 times, and ran the Sheldon House in Pine Orchard until his death in 1915. He is also buried in Center Cemetery. John Joseph Albinger was a native of Germany. He came to Branford before the war and enlisted as a private in the 15th Regiment. He fought at the Battle of Kingston, was captured, and returned to Branford when his term expired. He married Bridget Curtin and raised a large family. He is buried in St. Mary's Cemetery on Monroe Street. Richard Crosby was one of many Irish immigrants who fought in the Civil War. He was 37 with a wife and family when he enlisted. He was sick off and on during his 3-year term, but did fight at the Battle of Kingston, North Carolina, where he was captured with the rest of the regiment. Richard Crosby worked at the Malbel Iron Fittings Company and is buried in St. Mary's Cemetery. Like Edwin Towner of the 15th, Daniel Averill was first or orderly sergeant of Company B of the 27th Regiment. He was the first cousin of 2 other Branford soldiers and the brother-in-law of another. He returned to Branford, but in his later years moved to the Fitch's Soldier Home in Darien, where he died in 1913. His wife, Lucy Pond, died in 1922, and both are buried in Center Cemetery. Rodolphus Bartholomew was 43 years old when he enlisted as a private in Company B of the 27th. He had a wife and 4 children. He was a close friend of Sam Beach and is often mentioned in Beach's letters. Bartholomew drove the ambulance and wagons for the 27th during the war. He returned to Branford, was a member of the GAR, and died at the age of 85. He is also buried in Center Cemetery. His home on Windmill Hill Road still stands. Harvey Beach was in Company B, the 27th, and was the brother of soldiers George W. and William H. Beach, and the brother-in-law of Henry Hubbard, all in Company B. All of them returned home to Branford after the war. There are many cases where brothers and cousins enlisted in the same company or regiment. Another comrade in Company B was Edwin Wilford, known as Eddie. He was wounded in the leg at Fredericksburg and carried off the field by his comrades. His first cousin, George Wilford, died at Fredericksburg. Eddie was sent to Knight's Hospital in New Haven after the battle, where he spent the remainder of his term. After his discharge, he returned to Branford, where he was a farmer. He died in 1919 and was never married. In addition to his government-issued gravestone, nearby there is a beautiful metal monument for the Wilford family with various symbols, such as Edwin's GAR medal. Charles H. Frisbee of Branford enlisted in the 15th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry. He was in charge as wagon master of all the transportation at New Bern, North Carolina, over 1,000 horses and wagons. After the war, he was active in the GAR, and in this photograph wears his GAR medal proudly on his lapel. His government-issued gravestone is now encompassed by a huge beech tree. There are 80 Civil War veterans buried in Center Cemetery in Branford. This is the one I had the most trouble finding. Charles F. Lindsley was born in Branford and enlisted in the 15th Regiment. He was soon promoted to quartermaster sergeant and served in the commissary department for the rest of the war. Not all Branford men returned home. Lindsley moved to Meriden, where he was secretary and director of the Bradley and Hubbard Manufacturing Company, the maker of iron products. If you go to the Blackstone Library in the reference department, the stairwell and all the metal railings were made by this company. He died in Meriden in 1932 at the age of 89. Some Branford men enlisted elsewhere. Nicholas Terhune, seen here, and Frederick Lindsley enlisted together in the 2nd East Shore Maryland Volunteers for 3 years. They served in Maryland and Virginia, and I wish we knew why did they go to Maryland to enlist. After the war, Terhune came back to Branford, married Lucy Averill, the sister of Daniel Averill of the 27th, and Terhune was a charter member and commander of the GAR Post No. 7. Both Nicholas Terhune and Frederick Lindsley are buried in Center Cemetery. A few Branford natives had moved south before the war. Albert Towner Rogers moved to Virginia in 1857 and married there. He was drafted into the Confederate Army under General Stonewall Jackson, but since he was from the North, he worked in the field hospitals and as an ambulance driver. It was gruesome work. He served in that capacity at Antietam and in 21 other engagements. After the war, he returned to Branford with his family and is buried in Center Cemetery. There were only a handful of Branford men who enlisted toward the end of the war in the Navy, serving on vessels blockading the Carolina coasts. One of the sailors was Elwin Thayer. After the war, he was the longtime custodian of Center School on Main Street and a favorite of the children, who called him Cappy, though he was never a captain in the war. He died in 1936 at the age of 89, the last surviving Branford Civil War and GAR veteran. And yes, he is buried in Center Cemetery. And what happened to John Edward Towner? He came back to Branford, married Susan Hoadley, and had 3 children. He had a farm out East Main Street, now the site of Wilson Ford, and was commander of the GAR Post No. 7 and involved in the state GAR. He died in 1916 and is buried in Mill Plain Cemetery. We are grateful to his descendants for preserving his letters. This talk gives a brief glimpse of the service of Branford men in only 2 regiments. Branford soldiers enlisted in nearly every Connecticut regiment and fought in many battles throughout the war. Some died in battle or from disease. Others came home and resumed their lives. Their lives and that of our community were forever changed, and we should always honor their service and sacrifice.